Welcome to America Uncanceled. I'm Mercedes Schlapp. In a time when Americans are deeply divided on the most basic questions of national identity and purpose, how will this country pull forward together to address the problems facing our nation? Answering that question is renowned business expert and media contributor and friend of CPAC, Michael Wilkerson, who joins us today to discuss his brand new book, Why America Matters, the case for a new exceptionalism, reminding Americans about our country's meaning and our role in the world. Joining us now is Michael Wilkerson. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Mercedes, great to be with you and happy to, again, as you said, a longtime friend of CPAC, of you and Matt's, and just a pleasure to be able to be with you.
Oh, absolutely. I cannot wait to talk about this book. I know we saw each other down in Florida, and, you know, I think that it's so timely that you wrote this. Because I know a lot of people out there are saying, wait a second, is it too late to save America? Are we doing enough? Your thoughts?
My thoughts are it's not too late, and no, we're not doing enough. So both things are true. You know, I wrote this. This is the second book I wrote. The first one I wrote in 2000, in the middle of the depths of lockdowns. And that book was called Stormwall, and it basically looked at the tidal wave of crises that were hitting the country all at once. The pandemic, lockdown response, social unrest in our own country, inflation, which I started talking about when people thought I was very fringe and strange for mentioning it,
right.
And then this increasing conflict with the rising China. Why America Matters really was a continuation of that book, which was identifying the problems, but Why America Matters really seeks to try to get to some solutions and try to give Americans hope that there absolutely is a way forward here.
You mentioned in the book, today our culture is deeply divided on the most basic questions of national identity and purpose. We cannot find purpose without meaning, and we cannot find shared meaning when we cannot even agree on the facts of our own history. Are we at a point right now that you're seeing so many people on the left trying to rewrite history, trying to, I'd say, break down the fabric of our nation?
One of the main things I talk about is what I call the ideological attack, which is, you're absolutely right. There's been this slow undermining of facts, and people have different names for it, you know, sort of deconstructionism, critical theory. It translates into identity politics and practical matters. But the idea is comes from the intellectual world of people like Friedrich Nietzsche and others, even Karl Marx, who basically took a view that words don't matter, they don't have any meaning, right. We can twist them and use them for whatever we want. And to your point, where they've directed those powers, the powers of language, is to attempt to unwind the meaning of America and even the facts of our own history.
You mentioned, Michael, I know you talked about, and in the book you address this issue, the crises that did happen in the early 2000s, how that's impacting what's happening today. There's a lot of Americans out there that are saying, wait a second, we're losing this country fast. In the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic shift in where the American people are, especially with the young people that we know in these past midterm elections, over 60% voted for the Democrat Party. What is your sense in terms of looking back, comparing to early 2000s to what we're seeing right now?
All of the things that are going on today were going on then in the early 2000s. The problem is that most of us weren't aware of them. And I include myself in that I think it took the madness of 2020 to wake me up, and I think to wake up many Americans to what was actually happening. I talk about 4 categories of crises, which we can go into in a bit. One of them is the circumstances, which we talked about a little bit. The second is the crisis of identity.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what you're getting at today, is that Americans no longer really know who we are. And there are sort of 2 audiences for this book. One is sort of yours and mine, shared generation, where at some point in our childhood or in our past, we were taught these things. We were taught about American history. We were taught civics. Enough time has passed and enough ideological manipulation has happened that now we're questioning it. And this book is a reminder of those important things. For the younger generation that you mentioned, they've never been taught.
Right.
They don't know the facts of their own history, of this great nation, of the sacrifices that were put in place, of how radical the ideas of equality and liberty, and the idea that this was a government of the people, by the people, for the people. These things did not exist anywhere in history, anywhere else in the world. It was a radical experiment, and early Americans risked their lives to bring it about. Was it perfect? Far from. It took us another century to actually live up to some of the ideals that were expressed in the Declaration through a bloody civil war. But going back to your point, I think the issue for this younger generation is they don't know their history. They don't know. There's no public school civics these days,
right.
And there's a loss of understanding, which of course leaves them open to manipulation, to being told something else about their history, about the meaning of America, about the meaning of slavery. Is this a racist nation? All of these things that, of course, get so exaggerated in our culture and our media today.
There's a young woman who I think the mom was like a New York Harris type of individual who like paid $300 to help deprogram her daughter because she had gone to these liberal institutions. And, you know, it really does what I think the liberals do, and what Marxism, what happens with Marxism is that it divides the family. I don't know, and you've probably experienced this too. I've met parents that said, I sent my kid to college and they came back a flaming liberal. They hate America. They hate the family structure. And it really creates broken families. So I think there's something to be said about the fact that when you have these academic institutions pushing this type of agenda, it's like destructive, not only to the nation, but to the actual family itself.
Completely. And make no mistake, it's intentional. The idea is the purpose is to undermine the idea of God, of families as having any meaning. You know, we have a crisis of fatherlessness in our nation right now, and the left refuses to acknowledge it, that this is one of the main problems that have happened. Undermining traditional marriages, undermining families, generative families, undermining the idea that God has anything to say in our culture and society. And that is so counter to American history. While not everyone held, let's call it, orthodox beliefs, the founding fathers and that whole generation knew, whether they personally understood it or not, they knew the importance of religion. Without religion, there was no morality. Without morality, there's no trust. Without trust, you can't have an effective government, and especially not one that's a Republican government that relies on us being able to believe in and have trust in one another. That is being eviscerated today. It's intentional. It's undermining our young people and our nation.
Let me ask you, because you do tackle this issue of globalization, obviously something that I think has created a lot of panic amongst, I would say, conservative circles, truly. What when you were researching, looking into globalism, obviously you have a business background. What are the dangers of globalism? What does it mean for the United States?
It's very dangerous. And I will say, you know, I grew up at a time, or I went to graduate school at a time where this was the mantra. This was religion. So in the 1990s, doing graduate courses in international economics, business, or otherwise. And one of the things that was fascinating to me as I look back on it is the inevitability of it. There was really no choice. We had to globalize. This was the only way forward. Of course, this was going to happen. And there were very fancy mathematical models that could show why it was great for everybody and everything would be fine. It started with NAFTA. It started with the agreements with Europe, et cetera, welcoming China to compete with us, all of these things that went on. And the idea of globalism has different components: open borders, open markets, and open minds. And they're very seductive because they sound great on paper, but open borders, of course, undermines the fabric of our nation. Open borders, meaning the radical left today is pushing not legal structured immigration that's done in accordance with the strategic interests of the nation, but no, mass illegal immigration in order to change the culture, change the nature of what it means to be an American, with no assimilation, no acknowledgement of the values or the history of the country. Second, open markets, meaning, you know, we've got to buy all this stuff from China. We've got to shut down our factories here to do it. And of course, there were real underlying economic pressures. I'm not trying to oversimplify.
Right.
But you're right. So I grew up academically in this environment. I worked for over, going on 3 decades on Wall Street as a CEO of a public company. We were doing work in Africa, investing in food and energy security, financial services. And I could see the effects of it. And, just on the point, the idea of open markets only goes one way. The expectation was that the U.S. would open its doors, open its borders to China, but China would not have to reciprocate and do the same thing.
Right.
In fact, what I saw in nearly a decade investing in Africa was this massive push, this neo-colonial push of China to take and control the resources of Africa, not for the benefit of Africans, mind you, but for themselves. Now, you could understand that, but I think we have to realize the competitive pressures that we're facing. Nationalism is alive, it's not an evil force by itself. It's actually quite important. The idea of America first, in China, it should be China first. Each nation, each leadership ought to be thinking about its own people. Today, in our country, unfortunately, that is not happening.
Well, let me ask you, because obviously under President Trump, America First was his motto, right? And I think he did an effective job of pushing those policies. There's a quote in your book: Trump's America First rhetoric was misunderstood to a reversion to isolationism, but it was instead a call to arms. America needed to get tougher with both its enemies and its allies, each of which was seen as taking advantage of a soft and accommodative U.S. leadership. So walk us through, because obviously we're seeing Joe Biden take a different approach. We're seeing the protests that have happened not only in China, which have been unprecedented, but also in Iran. And yet you hear the Biden administration just so, like, there's just such weak responses coming out of that administration. Is it just fear? Is it just the fact they don't want to upset big, scary China and or provoke Iran?
I think you're absolutely right that there is a fear there of upsetting the apple cart in the relationship with China. I think what Trump did effectively was to recognize the game that was actually going on. We had lived for decades. And again, I throw myself into this bucket of not understanding what was actually going on that Trump sort of opened everyone's eyes to. It's like this Potemkin village, this facade of smiley faces waving hands at each other on both sides. And now we have lots of data, lots of evidence that supports this. What was actually going on was a massive illegal transfer of our intellectual property, of our value, of our know-how, of our factories, of everything. And to his credit, President Trump saw this, tried to communicate it. A lot of us didn't understand it, didn't necessarily believe it. And as you said, instead they said, oh, he just wants to take America back to 19th century isolationism. Not at all. What President Trump was reacting to was, if you think about isolationism and interventionism on a continuum, we had swung in the first part of the 21st century so far over towards interventionism. There was not a war that we didn't want to fight. There was not a conflict that America wanted to get involved in. And I called it a period of the endless wars, a period of swinging at bees, because we were accomplishing nothing and all we were doing was enraging our enemies. And the worst part, Mercedes, was that we took our eyes off of the real issue, which was China. We focused on Syria, we focused on Iraq, we focused on Afghanistan, we focused on eradicating Islamic terrorism, when the real war, the real battle was going on the other side of the world.
Right. No, it was definitely intensifying. China's in a much stronger position today, which is really disturbing, I think, for the United States. I do want to point to Klaus Schwab, founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, who is quoted saying that basically China is a model nation. Yeah. I mean, how can we in any way, what is up with these elitists, these types of big personalities that are pushing this message of supporting one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world?
Yeah, so going back to your question on globalism, because this links right in, one of the ideas of globalism in the open borders concept is that nations really aren't needed. They really shouldn't exist. What we should have is some supranational structure, like the EU, but expanded to incorporate all the world. And conveniently, it works out because China would love that too, and they would love to be in charge of it. When you read, and this comment by Klaus Schwab recently about China being a model, it's not the first time he said it. For years, he's been advocating the Chinese policy. pandemic lockdown responses were not something that sprung from the American ideas. These were totalitarian. They were Chinese in origin in terms of behavior, and Klaus Schwab praised them. He also said, look, we can't be too critical about potentially 1 million Uyghurs having been killed in a mass genocide over a decade, because people have different perspectives, and oh, by the way, in the world of quantum physics, it may actually not be such a bad thing after all. I wrote in the book, please, Mr. Schwab, explain that to the thousands of detainees who are still living, and millions who have died, that it's fine because it's in the quantum physics and it doesn't really matter. There's no absolute truth.
Wow. Well, I mean, let me ask you, what can the U.S. do to stop the spread of China into all these strategic nations, whether it be in Africa or whether it be in Latin America?
Well, first things first is we have to recognize, and I say this in the book, China is a great power. They are a rising power. And nothing that I'd say, and I don't believe that anything that President Trump said was intending to suppress the rise of China as a people, the country, the economy. We wish them well. We want them to succeed because obviously when billions of people are in poverty, bad things happen. The real enemy here is the authoritarian government, the Chinese Communist Party, that, as you can see by what's going on in the protests, and I talk about all the way back to Tiananmen Square, they made a decision that they were going to say yes to to capitalism, but no to democracy, no to real human rights, no to freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, you do. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And so, to answer your question, what we have to do is, first of all, look to our own house. What do we need to do? We need to protect our information. We need to protect our people. These massive surveillance and spying programs, even going on all the way today through social media like TikTok and otherwise, we continue to leak way too much important information. That's one thing. So let's stop the flow. Let's start asserting our rights in places where we have a strategic interest. Again, I don't believe that it's the role of the U.S. to get involved in every battle on every country anywhere in the world. I think it may be too late for us in Africa, given the role that China has in the historical legacy of Europe. It's never been a priority for the U.S. What has been a priority all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine was the Western Hemisphere, and that includes Latin America. And I do think we could be doing a lot more than we are today to buffer that encroachment by China on our own, in our own hemisphere, our own continents, where clearly that would become a real strategic and military danger if they do in Latin America what they're doing in Africa, building military bases, building forward deployment capabilities. Big danger. Great
point. It's one of the reasons why we just hosted CPAC Mexico, where we had 21 countries represented. We had several presidential candidates who will be running in Latin America, and they were so thrilled that we were able to organize the conservatives in Latin America because they understand the threat of China. They don't want China in their backyard. In fact, we don't want China in our backyard either. They're buying farmland in strategic places here within the United States. That needs to be stopped. I mean, obviously, you've seen Apple, where they're censoring and basically censoring the Chinese people, closing the loophole in that great firewall in China. I mean, which that should be completely unacceptable to have an American company basically collude with China. I mean, this is where we enter into the woke corporation phenomenon that has happened. Do you think woke corporations are going to come back to the middle? Is there any pressure for them to move back to the middle? Do they understand what's at stake when they're, going against American consumers?
So first of all, I think they know, and they're under enormous pressure. Their boards, their management teams, they're getting hit on all sides. So from the ESG movement, as an example of all the woke-related policies there, you can't invest in traditional energy sources, you can't do this, you can't do that, diversity, inclusion, transgenderism, all the stuff. Second, they're pressure from China. If they're trying to do business in the largest market of the world, they're trying to toe the line. And they're being pressured from the conservative side saying, hold on. You're an American company. We understand that you're there to make profits for your shareholders, but it's also been understood that you do have a duty, an obligation to your host country, to this nation. And so I think they're in a terrible conflict. I don't think we're doing enough. I think one of the things I keep coming back to in the book is the need for Americans in whatever walks of life they're in, whether as a parent in school board meetings or someone who can influence corporate boards, to remind them and to keep the pressure up on this side of the equation.
Right.
A very simple example, when Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta Airlines, came out in early 2001 against the changes in Georgia voting laws,
Yes.
it was completely because of pressure from the woke side. It had nothing to do with facts and figures. I wrote Mr. Bastian a letter saying, by the way, last time I checked, you did require me to show an ID when I get on your planes. So why is it that for the most important civic duty we have, that we shouldn't do the same?
Right.
That letter was not responded to, by the way. But it's an example
True.
that can be repeated 1,000 times in different situations.
Well, can I tell you, I can keep talking with you for like hours on end. This is just so fascinating. Great. I'm just so thrilled. Where can people buy your book? Where do they go?
So anywhere on Amazon. You can also go to whyamericamatters.com. You can find me there, or on stormwall.com, where I keep all my media articles, books, and things like that. Anywhere that digital books are sold, like Google Books, Apple Books, etc., you can find it. And hopefully you do. Hardcover, paperback, and then digital versions available.
Well, I want to make you CPAC's like chief economic analyst. You were so amazing on our show, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Mercedes, great to be with you. See you soon.
Okay. And remember, we have expanded to the podcast world, and you can listen to America Uncanceled with Matt and Mercedes Schlapp wherever you get your podcast, especially you young people. Let's not lose this country. You have to save it. We will see you next time. God bless.